Hello, everybody. I'm John from Kraft Music, and today we're here to check out the Arturia DrumBrute analog drum synthesizer. For a great deal on DrumBrute, please check out our bundles at craftmusic.com. DrumBrute brings together three of Arturia's areas of focus and expertise, those being analog synth and filter circuits, sequencers, and hardware drum machine interfaces. And starting with the oldest or longest running, DrumBrute borrows much of its hardware interface from Arturia's Spark Creative Drum Machine and Spark LE, which are hybrid products that pair a hardware controller with a software instrument. Arturia's industrial design language evolved quite a bit as they went from their older analog experience keyboard controllers through the Origin synthesizers, this original Spark Creative Drum Machine, and then the Spark LE, which was a redesign of the controller portion of the Spark package that really cemented the design language that's come to define modern Arturia, continuing not only through the BeatStep products, but also the keyboard controller redesign that saw the older analog experience controllers replaced with the newer Keylab series. The various versions of mini brutes and micro brutes had kind of by necessity their own separate but similar style, and it's arguably in the DrumBrute where we really see the controller style and the brute style come together. And in addition to these general product design trends of interest to industrial design enthusiasts or people who follow the Arturia line, you can see much more specifically that despite having about 3 years between them on the Arturia product timeline, that DrumBrute borrows its transport controls from the Spark LE, as well as its bank and pattern structure, and even these pattern length controls and indicators here. The velocity-sensitive instrument pads here at the front of each piece aren't exactly the same size, but have roughly the same stiffness or feel. And while there are some necessary differences between how these two controls function, the general concept of having a touch surface, both for roll or retrig step entry, and also for looping or beat repeat style performance controls, has also made the jump from Spark LE to DrumBrute. DrumBrute, as the analog drum synthesizer tagline would indicate, uses all analog circuitry to generate its sounds with no reliance on PCM sample playback of any kind. All of these sound shaping controls you see across the front are not encoders, but are fully analog potentiometers with continuous voltage-based values across their ranges and no digital control whatsoever. This is great, and Arturia here shows the same commitment to fully analog sound and control that we've seen in the mini and micro brutes. But similar to those synths, the lack of digital control also means that your sound and kit parameter values are not scanned or sampled in any way or stored with your patterns. So while this shouldn't be a deal breaker for most applications or users, we feel it's important to point out here that the lack of anything digital in the DrumBrute sound engine not only means no parameter locking or motion sequencing or MIDI automation, it also means that when you recall one of your patterns from memory, it has no effect on these sound parameters whatsoever. Those are controlled only by these potentiometers and are continuous across an entire session as you switch from pattern to pattern or song to song. This gives DrumBrute some commonality with classic XOX style drum machines, and similar to those, DrumBrute boils its sound shaping parameters down to the essentials, with several sounds offering just control over overall level and pitch or tone. There are a couple that add a decay parameter. And then the main kick and snare sounds get special treatment with 5 parameters each and greater control over those sounds' various component parts. There are 12 instrument pads across the front here, but some of them perform double duty for a total of 16 different instruments. The low and high toms double as congas. The cymbal channel also has a reverse cymbal. And then the other pairs are rim shots and claves and maracas and tambourines. While these doubled up channels will share their sound parameter settings, they do each get their own sequencer lanes. So you can use both and you don't have to choose between one or the other. The other part of DrumBrute that lives strictly in the analog domain with no digital control or scanning whatsoever is the Brute Standard Steiner-Parker filter, which on DrumBrute can be used in either low-pass or high-pass modes with control over cutoff frequency and resonance. The filter's location in the signal path, sort of on the overall kit just before the outs, seems to suggest that it's mainly here as a performance feature, providing for dramatic low-pass filter sweeps or high-pass quasi-breakdowns. That said, don't underestimate the filter's utility as a sound shaping tool. There are times when you're dialing in a kit when it can be much more effective and or expedient just to maybe roll off some of the highs or add a little resonance bite than it is to keep messing with individual sound levels and pitches or tones. So, having covered the resolutely analog sound engine on DrumBrute, let's look now at its digital side, which consists mainly of the pattern sequencer along with some pattern level performance controls. The sequencer ought to be familiar not only to those of you who have used the Spark and the Spark LE, but also to users of Arturia's BeatStep products. Its bank and pattern structure is easy to wrap your head around, with 4 banks of 16 patterns each, and similarly easy to understand controls for saving, erasing, and copying patterns. There are also easy to grasp options to copy or erase individual instrument sequencer patterns from instrument or to instrument or even to another pattern. And DrumBrute also has a basic song mode, which lets you string together up to 16 patterns and store up to 16 different songs. The pattern effects section here has been brought over from the BeatStep Pro, though it leaves behind the probability control. And while these values can be used during performance to generate some ersatz fills or pattern variations, their values can also be stored with your patterns, and in addition to being applied to entire patterns, can also be applied with different values to the individual sequencer tracks within a pattern. When we first got this DrumBrute, we were a little surprised as we dialed up the randomness setting to hear it introducing hits into sequencer tracks that were otherwise silent, but a recent DrumBrute firmware update stopped that behavior. The ability to have different swing settings for different sounds and sequencer tracks is great. And while cranking up the overall randomness can generate some interesting results, we found it most effective applied to individual tracks at fairly modest levels, which can serve to humanize a pattern, not by messing with timing, but by adding or dropping the odd trigger here and there for a slightly less rigid and predictable pattern playback. Speaking of humanizing via timing adjustments, while DrumBrute won't automate any kind of timing variation or slop, it can record in almost real time, call it super relaxed quantizing, and you can go in after the fact and adjust the timing of individual steps forward or back. Any individual step can be shifted by a percentage value up to 50% forward towards the next step or backward toward the previous one. And since DrumBrute stores these timing shifts as percentage values rather than in an absolute sense of milliseconds or pulses, steps with shifted timing will retain their timing relative to the grid at any playback tempo. Over here next to the pattern effects section is the touch strip. I think we've referred to this a couple times already as a performance control, and it is in terms of providing looping or beat repeat style effects during pattern playback. Touch strip is also used when you're making patterns to enter roll or retrig effects on individual hits. And the way it does this is to treat the retrigs as occurring at set percentage-based distances between the regular grid locations, which again lets the retrig scale to any playback tempo. As you can see here, underneath the touch strip, there are these 1 through 4 values for the different pad sections. And to enter a roll into the sequencer, you just hold down on one of these values and then enter a step. There are a couple of other performance type features worth mentioning, the first of which is mute and solo groups. Both of these controls make it really easy to gang up a group of sounds and then quickly toggle them on and off. And there's also an easy way with the shift key to quickly clear out that group and start over again. Mute and solo groups are global, and those groups are not saved with a pattern, so they really come into play more at the performance level as opposed to during pattern composition. That said, at the pattern level, there's another great performance feature for doing fills and breakdowns and variations, and that's toggling off DrumBrute's wait to load pattern parameter. It's typical expected behavior on most drum machines that if you switch to a new pattern, it will actually change when it's done playing the current pattern. If, however, you make a bunch of duplicates of your pattern and make some different variations for fills or breakdowns or what have you, and then turn off that parameter such that DrumBrute makes pattern changes instantly, you can then have lots of fun during playback or performance coming up with different ways to play your patterns. We've mentioned a couple of timing controls or parameters that record and store their values as percentages of grid locations rather than in absolute terms. And the decisions that Arturia's designers made in how to handle those time-based events come in especially handy if you decide to use DrumBrute's global BPM mode. Every DrumBrute pattern does store a tempo along with its other sequencer settings. But if you want to string together a bunch of patterns or songs for a live set, you can force them all to adhere to DrumBrute's global BPM setting by toggling it on here. Next to global BPM is a toggle for polyrhythm, which is a pattern level option that is saved with each pattern that allows different instruments or sequencer tracks to have different step lengths, which can make for some really interesting patterns that don't strictly repeat every time they cycle. We can demonstrate this here by taking one of the preset patterns, turning polyrhythm on, and then setting some different step lengths for certain instruments. Arturia has a piece of companion utility software called MIDI Control Center that's been used with the beat step and key step sequencers and is now also used with DrumBrute. And in addition to using MIDI Control Center to do firmware updates and to toggle various global and pattern level parameters, you can also use MIDI Control Center to shuttle patterns and banks into and out of DrumBrute's internal memory in case you find yourself hitting your head on its storage ceiling. And you can also actually edit patterns right in MIDI Control Center on a familiar grid interface, which can be a big benefit to anyone coming over from editing patterns on a piano roll in a DAW, and can also be a great way to visualize certain pattern level editing features we've been talking about, like polyrhythms or step repeats. Turning once more back to the hardware, specifically the back panel, DrumBrute offers 5-pin MIDI in and out, USB port for MIDI over USB, as well as connection to the MIDI Control Center software, and 1/8-inch clock in and out jacks for sending and receiving clock signals at a variety of PPQ resolutions. There are 1/4-inch and 1/8-inch headphone outputs with a dedicated headphone volume knob, a 1/4-inch mono main mix output, and then 12 individual outputs for the different instrument circuits, which are a real boon not only for multi-track recording, but also for live post-processing of DrumBrute's sound. The scheme for using these individual outputs is much more intuitive, if a little less flexible than it is on other modern drum machines. As soon as you plug in a cable to one of the individual outs, that instrument is removed from the main mix out. So you can tap the individual outs and leave the rest to the main mix just by plugging in cables and without having to configure anything in DrumBrute settings. DrumBrute has a fantastic raw analog sound that is well suited in its unprocessed state to a variety of styles and genres. That said, much like certain classic drum machines, it's also a sound that cleans up well and can benefit greatly from some post-processing depending on what kind of sound you're going for. In a video we made for the Keith McMillan Instruments K-Mix mixer and audio interface, one of the applications we discussed but didn't actually demonstrate was pairing K-Mix with an instrument that has individual outs. Let's tap just a handful of DrumBrute's individual outputs and see how they can benefit from some of the onboard DSP on K-Mix handling EQ, compression, and reverb. So that's Arturia DrumBrute, an intuitive and affordable drum machine that offers the great analog sound you'd expect from the company behind the Mini Brute and Micro Brute, coupled with the powerful and flexible sequencer you'd expect from the company behind the BeatStep and BeatStep Pro. For a great deal on DrumBrute, please check out our bundles at craftmusic.com. And as always, if there is a tweak you'd like to make to one of our existing bundles, swapping out a cable here and there, or a whole combination that you don't see there, such as pairing DrumBrute with K-Mix, please feel free to get in touch with one of our sales advisors over phone, chat, or email, and we'd be happy to give you a great deal on a custom bundle. Once again, I'm John from Kraft Music. Thanks for watching.